Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a continued passion for public television, we are proud to underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES television.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, we're told the number of candidates to be the city's next police chief is down to 6. Something that each finalist will have to think about is overseeing a city with high incidence of crimes against women and where detectives are falling behind in solving murders. Some encouraging news is the emergence of violence interrupters who specialize in trying to divert potential crimes. We'll look at these stories tonight as well as the latest in the fall elections, and our Future Watch segment examines the progress of the ambitious restoration plans for the Dome. On the field for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Missy Wilkinson, staff writer, the Times Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And John Simerman, staff writer, the Times Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. And we will stay with John right now. You did a piece about the murder solve rate in the city of New Orleans, and then also even more challenging because of what the detectives are facing.
Yes, so Jeff Adelson, our data editor, and I took a pretty close look at how the NOPD is doing in solving murders over this 3.5 year surge in killing that we've seen since the start of 2020. They certainly don't have any more officers or homicide detectives than they did back then. As you might expect, they're inundated with cases, and that's showing up in how many of these cases or what percentage of them are leading to arrest. And what we found was there have been nearly 800 murders in the city since the start of 2020, and more than 500 of them have not led to arrest. Some of those suspects or people who have killed are probably dead themselves. The NOPD accounts for some of those. But other things we learned is that if they're not solving these cases early, they're not solving a lot of them. Not a lot of whodunits that drag on are getting solved, and that goes to the high volume. But one of the take-homes is also that the manpower shortage in the force as a whole, and the task forces and patrol cops running from call to call, has an effect also on, their ability in the homicide unit to solve some of these things.
So what is how does New Orleans rate against other cities in terms of solve rates?
It has pretty poorly. There's not a great apples to apples that you can do in the last few years, but the Washington Post did a study of 50 big U.S. police departments in 2018. They looked back a decade and found that the New Orleans Police Department really struggled. They had a very low arrest rate, one of the lowest, and one of the highest caseloads. That certainly has gotten worse since. There are 19 regular homicide detectives that rotate through these homicides. There was a 2010 study that said they shouldn't do more than 6 of those investigations in a year. Those guys last year, when we're the murder capital of America, we're doing 12, 13, 14 a year. You talk to detectives. That's sort of untenable the way some of them see it.
Let me just mention one recently, the Mandinas murder. I thought they did an amazing job on getting that lead suspect, or maybe they were lucky. Finding the guy's wallet, but they did get a suspect, and they did that. On the other hand, from the very beginning, they mentioned that there was somebody else that night too. I haven't heard a word about the other person. Is he forgotten, or is it just?
That's a good question. Don't know the answer to it. Haven't followed that one.
I didn't mean to answer that, but just things that are going on out there.
And a lot of times it's that, good fortune that, some piece of evidence will turn up. And what some studies have shown is that, it's not just the homicide detective. It's the first officer who shows up and the witnesses that they're able to speak to or the evidence that they're able to preserve that makes a big difference in how these things develop. And we've talked a lot about response rates for 911 calls and our low manpower, and sometimes these districts having 3-4 officers on duty in a shift. So it all kind of interrelates, I think.
So what counts as a solved murder?
To the FBI, and where the local police departments give data to the FBI, but that system has sort of changed, and so that data is kind of dicey on what the NOPD is able to provide. What the sort of standard is that if you arrest somebody, or if your suspect has died, or there's some way that you can't arrest them, then that counts as a solved case. Now, sometimes NOPD will throw in, we've issued warrants and haven't arrested these people yet, and they might use that in their calculations. We sort of try to strip all that out and just look at the cases. Here's how many murders there were, here's how many led to arrest.
Okay, led to arrest, but what about convictions too?
Convictions are a whole other thing, and that can be 4 or 5 years later. So we don't know how most of these cases are going to play out. But we do know that about 1/3 of cases since 2015 of those arrests have gone away by refusal or dismissal. So that's pretty, they're not going to trial, they're not going to plea deals. So, what happens to the reinvestigation of those cases varies.
So you profile a case, which was a high-profile case, of 3 homicides in one home, and they were not discovered for 10 days. But on the day of the murder, if I'm reading this correctly, a police officer had showed up?
Yeah, there was a case, and people might remember it, on January 3rd, police came across 3 decomposed bodies in a house right near the fairgrounds. Missy covered it. And it was a pretty run-down house. And talking to neighbors, they started talking about some shots that were reported 2 weeks or 10 days earlier, before they found the bodies. And in sort of trying to, understand, what they saw, I looked at a bunch of records, talked to people, and turns out that the police are now acknowledging that the shooting 10 days before at a trailer park across the street was related. An officer came out from the 3rd District, spoke to a woman across the street in that building, in that house, or outside of the house where they eventually found those bodies. What happened with that conversation, police don't want to say, but not much happened with it. They kind of cleared that call. And so a lot of neighbors are kind of frustrated. They feel like police missed an opportunity, possibly, to find the person who killed these people. A lot of that goes on with these unsolved cases. You have families who think they know who did it and are expecting police to make these arrests, and that sort of goes to the challenges the police have in trust and confidence.
So that triple murder, there is no suspect?
There may be a
custody?
suspect, but they haven't named a suspect, and there's no arrest.
Okay. All right, John, Missy, let's go on over to you so to continue this conversation, too, because something that we have seen in the city are women becoming victims of crimes. We've seen, for a while there was just really a spate of them. And so tell us more about that. And there were 2 recent ones just in this past week.
Yes, I think it's worth mentioning too that one of the victims from that triple homicide was a girl, a 14-year-old girl. So we're seeing also juvenile females dying. We saw that on Friday. Actually, one of these victims was a 17-year-old girl. Her name was Leah Perry. She was the mother of a 5-month-old child, apparently gunned down in a drive-by shooting. So I think while we're not seeing a huge departure in the overall number of women who are being murdered compared to years past, some people feel that they're being targeted in a way that's different. And then some of these domestic situations seems like they're escalating. We are seeing a slightly higher number of victims that are just overall shot that are women. So right now we're at 83 women murdered, 83 women shot, and of those 18 have died from their wounds. So that's just a little bit more than we saw last year, which was, again, kind of an epic year as far as bloodshed. Last year, 16.5% of people who had been shot were women. This year, 20% of the people who have been shot are women. So it's not the direction you really want to see things going.
No, it definitely isn't. And then also the other murder that was reported this week was of a 27-year-old, and this was, 47-year-old woman, domestic.
Yes, that's correct. And her husband did confess and turn himself into police hours after the fatal shooting. And unfortunately, her sister and her daughter were the people that found her and called police, in fact. So just a very tragic story, a tale of domestic abuse that unfolded over decades, mental illness between both her and her husband, and escalating violence that ultimately claimed her life and pretty sad, really sad case.
A 4-year-old child
We just want
left
to
behind
qualify,
in this.
these are not necessarily anti-woman crimes. I mean, they're not being shot because they're women, or they're just because of the circumstances that they happen to be in.
You know, it's hard to generalize because they're all different. From what I can see, they don't seem to be targeted hate crimes that are enacted out of some underlying misogyny. They do seem to be conflicts that escalate to violence. They do seem to be women that are targeted for whatever reason. Our mayor has implied that it is because of criminal involvement in some cases, and sometimes people are just in the wrong place at the same time, wrong time. It's hard to say what's behind all of it, but it is a disturbing trend, especially since it's leaving a lot of children without their mothers at critical junctures in their lives.
And some of these children are actually witness to the murders of their mothers, too.
Yes.
Really tragic.
Yes.
All right, Missy, thanks. So let's go on back over to you. It's still sort of staying with this crime situation. The person who is going to be named the permanent superintendent maybe revealed soon of the New Orleans Police Department, who has to deal with these crime rates.
That's right. We're sort of down to it in Mayor Cantrell's national search for a new police chief. We're 6 months or about 7 months since Sean Ferguson left. We have interim chief Michelle Woodfork, who is one of those 6 candidates. She's the only one identified so far. There's sort of been a lot of concern and criticism over the mayor's keeping the rest of those names under wraps for now. Next week, there'll be 2 days of interviews. We'll see how many of those 6 show up for that. And then the mayor will, there will be 2 panels, one of city officials, the other of external, I guess, stakeholders. And we know a little bit about some of the people who are going to be on those panels, but not much. Oliver Thomas, the councilman, is going to be on it. Fraternal Order of Police will have a representative, and there will be others. But to what extent their recommendations really matter to how the mayor, what she chooses to present before the city council under this new law that voters passed like last year, a charter amendment that grants them confirmation authority. So we'll see what she does, but she's going to put a name up to them, and then they'll get a vetting before the council.
It used to be prior to that new law that the mayor just said, here's the new police chief.
That's right. Or did a national search, or tried to be inclusive and include community members, and sometimes still undergo criticism because ultimately it's the mayor's choice.
But it will go before council this year.
Correct.
And the choice will. So council will have to approve whomever the mayor does select from this group?
Yes, and there was some talk from J.P. Morrell, Councilman Morrell, about we should know more of these names. And I think that's sort of the bottom line is, can this council, when they're confirming a candidate, how much do they know about the other people who, who might be next? And that's a sort of a question. We'll see how much comes out before those meetings about what those names.
So there is a certain organization that's been handling this whole process. Tell us about that.
The International Association of Chiefs of Police, and they do a lot of these recruiting and searches for police chiefs. Some of it is none of these people want people to know that they're applying for these jobs. They might be working, as a police chief or an assistant chief in another department. And so this is one way of keeping these things away from the public. Certainly they are experienced in these searches. There were 33 candidates or applicants who applied, which is pretty low when you look historically at New Orleans police chief searches. Ronald Surpass, the former chief, thinks that's because there are 2 years left on the mayor's term. There's a lot of turmoil. She doesn't have the council's backing, a lot of this stuff, who wants to come in. So we don't know how many of these 6 are from outside and from inside.
So the interim police chief right now is on that list. We do know that.
We do know. The mayor's confirmed that. And so it sort of looks like Michelle Woodfork versus the field at this point.
Are we going to find out the names next week? Will we know?
Certainly hope so. We think they're public. The IACP is supposed to, under their contract with the city, deliver profiles of their finalists to the city. The city is saying we don't have them. At a certain point, that doesn't become realistic.
Okay.
You had an interesting story this morning that when Mark Morial, as mayor, made his appointment, they had a blue ribbon committee to decide and to make recommendations. They got together, said, here are our choices, Mayor. Mayor said, hey, you did a great job, but I got one guy.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the phrase he used, I have a unicorn, and that was Chief Pennington.
That was Pennington, who's sort of been revered as the guy who brought murders way down and took, took on corruption in New Orleans police.
Okay, we'll see what happens next week. Okay, Missy, over to you, and still sticking with this crime issue. Violence interrupters. Now, those were used earlier, some years back in a program called Ceasefire under the Landrieu administration.
Yeah.
So they're returning.
Yeah, to bring it back to the chief conversation, it was Landrieu and Serpas who launched this. It was based on a 2004 model that started in Chicago by epidemiologist Gary Slutkin. Basically, he looked at gun violence as a disease and applied a disease model to it, that this is a learned behavior and it can be unlearned. And so credible messengers who are credible because of their connections to the community and their lived experience with the criminal justice system and gun violence, basically would go out and stop violence before it started. And they would do this through a number of different ways. It could have been connecting people with social services, resources they needed, getting people down to just sit down and talk about a conflict before it escalated to violence. And it was really successful in New Orleans when it launched. The 10 by 10 block of Central City, where it started around 2010, 2011, showed a pretty drastic reduction in shootings as the years went by. It's a pretty time-tested model, and it's being relaunched, fortunately, with a little bit of a different direction. It's going to be helmed by University Medical Center instead of the city, and it's going to add long-term case management and wraparound services to these victims. So basically, when they show up in the hospital with a gunshot wound, one of these violence interrupters will deploy immediately to the scene, sit bedside with them, be like, what do you need? What do you need to be successful once you get out of here? And also de-escalate any existing beefs or tension that might erupt in violence. It happens, you see it all the time, it happens really fast sometimes.
So I know with the original one, among the violence interrupters, they would actually go to the hospital. When a shooting happened, they'd go and just try to intervene there and talk to perhaps the victims' families and just try to prevent something from escalating. Is that going to still be part of it?
Yes, that's still a big part of it. They would, in the past, they would go to homicide scenes. They would go to areas where they knew like maybe some tension existed and maybe something was about to go down. But now they're going to be like just mostly focusing it in the hospital. It's really difficult work in a lot of ways. They are first responders. They are responding to just kind of the most terrible stuff. And so I think that they have to be more cognizant also of their own like burnout. But on the other hand, it's rewarding work for the people who are in these roles because they're saving lives and they see it day to day. And walking around with them, you can see the lasting impact that this work that was done more than a decade ago still has in Central City.
How do they protect themselves from being in the middle of those beefs, too?
I mean, that's a good question, and it is dangerous, actually. A violence interrupter recently was killed, and I forget where, but
not here in the
No,
city.
it wasn't here in New Orleans. But it's a high-risk job.
And this is not a volunteer position, is it? It's a paid position, and people are sort of vetted on it?
Yes, correct. So the job listings are going to go live within the next month, according to Dr. Jennifer Avegno, who is sort of spearheading the program and bringing it back in its new form. They're going to pay $40,000 to $50,000 per role. There will be about 5 or 6 violence interrupters hired. And it doesn't require like a certain degree, but it does require deep empathy and familiarity with this life experience.
And so the individuals will be hired by UMC, Universal Medical Center?
Yes, that is my understanding, yes.
And then the funding is coming through from the city through a grant?
It is coming from a Wisner grant, a $459,000 Wisner grant.
Okay.
And these individuals work parallel to police. They don't inform police. They don't try to stop gangs from forming. They just really want to stop killings before they start.
Okay, all right.
All the years has been arguing about what to do with Wisner grant money. Interrupting violence is a good...
Interrupting violence,
good
definitely.
solution,
It would put it to good use indeed. Okay, Missy, thanks a lot. All right, Dawn, over to you. Well, let's talk something that's pleasant.
A little happier.
Yeah, a little bit happier. And the dome's getting a facelift.
The dome is in phase 4 or year 4 of a 5-year, $500 million facelift that's being funded by the state of Louisiana, the Louisiana Stadium and Exposition District, and the Saints. The state's cut of that is just $54 million of the $500 million, just so everybody knows. This current phase is really getting rid of, those ramps you have to walk up when you go into a Saints game? They will be no more. You will go in through new 3-level atrium doors, both by Gate B and Gate H on the 2 sides of the dome. And within what I'm told are 3 simple escalator rides, you can be from the bottom level all the way up to the 600 level. Because of the loss of the ramps, the concourses have been widened. These new atriums will have restaurants and bars and a Saints store in each of them, so much more open and bright. New restrooms throughout the dome. because the ramps went away, they were able at the 300 level on the suites, they've all been expanded in length. And really new bars, new amenities throughout. For all of us at this table, new media room as well for interviews. So instead of the tiny little room we were cramped in before that really wasn't conducive to doing the work we do, a much larger room with lighting and cameras and that sort of thing. This is all ahead of the Super Bowl, which is going to be here in February of 2025. The work, it's tricky. It is very tricky work because they have to fit it in between whenever the Saints end their season and whenever the Saints begin their season, and they have to wrap up work for Essence. Those are the two really kind of protected things that happen in the Dome. It's about the Saints and about Essence being able to happen, and whatever can kind of fit in around those two times can also happen as well. For instance, Taylor Swift's tour didn't come here because there was no time that was going to work. But we had the NCAA Final Four here, and that was already on the schedule, so work happened around that, and events could happen around that. Garth Brooks is coming in Labor Day weekend. That was just announced. So there are big events still coming. There are certain ones that haven't fit into the schedule because of this work, but there are others that are certainly still coming. What you'll notice as a fan is the new bathrooms, the wider concourses, new food and dining experiences. Something that's happened in other stadiums around the country, instead of waiting in a line and then ordering, it's more grab and go concept. You grab your things and then go to the cash register and pay on the way out. And cash registers will remain cashless in the Dome. It's a cashless situation, even though we called them a cash register. So just big changes for the fans in terms of the experience and the light and the bright and the ease of getting in and getting out.
And not have to labor up and down those
Up
ramps.
and down those ramps.
So, I mean, that's really going to be a big load for those escalators, because I can just remember the crowds going up the ramp. Now the escalator's going to have to handle that.
Apparently, the experts say it's going to be a much faster, easier, simple way to get people in and to their seats and without lines. We'll be able to test it, I guess. August 13th is the first Saints game. They are currently laying down the field now. It seems, it's hard to believe that it's, here we go. The work that happened in this time off, you'll just notice the differences and the beauty of it. Then there are false walls on the west side of the Dome. The east side of the Dome is done. The west side is being worked on. Some work will happen throughout the season. There are walls up, so you won't see what's going on behind those walls. You might not even know that there's more dome to be had behind that wall. And then the final push then will happen whenever the Saints end their season in 2024, before the season starts again in the fall.
So it sounds like it really is bringing the Dome up to more 21st century
More 21st
standards.
century, better ADA compliant seat choices, new elevators, new restrooms, new concessions. We're not getting a new stadium, but we're getting a new stadium.
Yeah, but it's the Dome, the iconic Dome. Nothing
Yes.
can replace that Dome. All right, Don, thanks a lot.
Sure.
E, over to you. Elections, you wanted to
Well,
catch us up on
well,
what's
three
going on.
factors about the elections. One, today's July 14th. The election day is 3 months from today, right? And so it's October 14th. That'll be the primary. Between now and then, we're going to have qualifying in August, and then the campaigning. The polls, there's about 8 or 9 people who are running. The polls have been consistently showing.
And we're talking governor here.
For governor, 2 people as front runners. One is Jeff Landry, who's the Attorney General. He usually gets, and there's several polls, and so they have aggregate kind of polls. He's usually like in the 32 percentile. The other is Sean Wilson, who people probably less familiar with. He was Secretary of the State's Department of Transportation. He's a Democrat, and it's relevant that he's the lone black candidate in that, which will give him a certain vote there. But he had a really good reputation as Secretary of Transportation, and John Bell Edwards is behind him, and actually all the named Democrats are behind him too. And so that'll be it. And so right now, that's the most likely runoff. But I think the thinking is politically is that Jeff Landry looks pretty good. Some Republicans got to kind of figure out how to get into that runoff and squeeze past it. Another factor, though, I think a major moment in this race was when Billy Nungesser decided not to run for governor. That a year ago, if we'd have been talking about it, we were going to say, well, Nungesser, he's lieutenant governor, and he would have been a major contender. Maybe not necessarily the natural winner, but certainly as lieutenant governor, he has a strong base across South Louisiana. So when he decided not to run, that really opened up a lot of possibilities. Plus, they kind of took out the lieutenant governor's race, because there would have been a big lieutenant governor's race, and they ain't not hearing about it. So none guest has been able to go to Australia and New Zealand to attract tourism rather than having to worry about this kind of thing. But the other thing I don't think people realize, a factor about our elections now, is that they are now scheduled a year before the presidential election. And so that means, I think, increasingly presidential politics is going to kind of interplay some years without race. And so if by next October, if Trump's really popular, I mean, Trump's always been popular in Louisiana, but presidential candidates, and certainly if you get into a runoff in November, and I doubt if Biden has strong coattails in Louisiana, but the presidential race could be a factor also.
Okay. All right. So 3 months not from today, but in 3 months.
3 months from today.
From today, actually. We go to the polls to select our next governor, at least in the primary.
It'll be a Saturday, as Louisiana's elections always are, Saturday, October 14th.
All righty, thanks, and we stick with you with other stories.
Dawn had mentioned the Garth Brooks thing coming to Superdome. I think this is a bigger story than people realize, because it's going to give a big event for the Superdome and for New Orleans on Labor Day weekend, which is usually kind of a dull weekend. Country music has not always done well in Louisiana, except when Garth Brooks performs. Earlier in the year, he performed in Baton Rouge, Tiger Stadium, 100,000 people, filled all the seats. And so if this creates a big event, and they're referring to it as the first annual Sugar Bowl Kickoff Classic, and so if this becomes a big event every year for Labor Day, that could be a real boost.
Definitely could be. Thanks. Missy, over to you.
Oh, let's see. I'm kind of chipping away at this domestic violence disturbing surge that we're seeing. Just trying to find out more about what could be driving it. A preliminary look at calls for service reveals that May saw a pretty big spike in calls related to domestic violence. So trying to figure out what's behind that.
Okay. Dawn.
Speaking of big events, after Garth Brooks, it's Beyonce on September 27th. So hopefully the hurricanes will stay away and the big events can come in.
Absolutely. Okay, John, over to you.
Well, it's still a little unclear who's in charge of police recruiting. The mayor recently said that the NOPD has taken that back sort of from the Police and Justice Foundation, which is the booster organization. And the police chief said this week that they're still involved. So we're trying to get to the bottom of that a little bit.
Okay, and just a real quick touch back to the names in the search. The candidates themselves will actually be in town. Will we see them?
We were going to try to see them, certainly.
Okay, we'll find out. All right, thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and then we will see you again next week from Forum Sources. Have a good evening.
Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a continued passion for public television, we are proud to underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES Television.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.